So we're going through this fairy tale in great detail and in depth to give you a sense of how to work, how one works with archetypal material. And it's the same way that one works with dreams. And this was deeply impressed upon me when I wrote my case report for the case exam as one of the 6 final exams at the Zurich Jung Institute, along with the fairy tale exam in psychiatry. The case was a woman with a serious mental condition, and we worked from the very beginning with her dreams. She recorded dreams almost nightly, and our therapy focused on dream work, being able to discuss in our sessions only half to a third of her dreams. For the case report, I read all the dreams from our 9 months of analysis and saw the progression in our work, the setbacks, and how the dreams related to the relationships in her life. I saw how basic themes emerged and evolved and how interconnected dreams are. Case write-ups prove to oneself important aspects of dream work. But as an analyst, you don't have time or take the time to do such a deep and careful analysis with any one case. I've only done it twice since my Zurich days. The second time with the case presented at the China Sand Play Conference in November, December of 2022 about the hexagrams from the I Ching appearing in the dreams of a Western man over an 18-month period. But you need only one good case write-up to convince yourself. So as I said last time or the time before, I think Jungian psychology is the simplest system to begin to approach something as complex as the human psyche. Many people think it is too complex, but like I said, our human psyche is incredibly complex. So the theory is great, but you have to be able to live it and be able to work that theory in your practice. And dream work, I think, especially with a series of important dreams, is the best way to see how theory can come to life. And working with fairy tales, practicing with fairy tales, like I said once before, is the best way to be able to look for the deep archetypal patterns in the dreams and in the life of the individual. So an element that I would like to discuss before we resume working on Cinderella is the motif of threeness in archetypal materials and in dreams. Things happen 3 times, and then it's on to another phase. There's an adage, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And I would add, so the next time you try to fool me, hopefully I'll be aware of what's happening. And we'll see that with the prince's reaction when Cinderella left the ball for the 3rd time. This is the efficiency of how films and fairy tales work, but in waking life, the pattern is usually repeated many times and indeed may never be broken. So as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, Cinderella at the balls are true albedo moments in alchemy, the first light showing forth from the darkness of the Negredo. It's an inflammatory moment. I gave an example of a young woman who was strongly attracted to a young man who then asked her out for a date. All the thoughts that she has about the young man before she goes out with him would be her inflated animus fantasies, the albedo phase of a relationship. We got Cinderella at the ball. We got her out to the ball last time. And this is what happens next in our fairy tale. She danced till it was evening, and then she wanted to go home. But the king's son said, I will go with you and bear you company, for he wished to see whom the beautiful maiden belonged. She escaped from him, however, and sprang into the pigeon house. The king's son waited until her father came, and then he told him the unknown maiden had leapt into the pigeon house. The old man thought, can that be Cinderella? And they had to bring him an axe and a pickaxe that he might hew the pigeon house to pieces, but no one was inside it. And when they got home, Cinderella was in her dirty clothes among the ashes, and a dim little oil lamp was burning on the mantelpiece. For Cinderella had quickly jumped down from the back of the pigeon house and had run to the little hazel tree, and there she had taken off her beautiful clothes and lay them on the grave. And the bird had taken them away again, and then she seated herself in the kitchen amongst the ashes in her gray gown. So notice that the change in Cinderella's attitude occurs as evening approached. In other words, as the power of the unconscious began to ascend. So we explored the symbolism of the pigeon before, being Aphrodite's bird, the goddess Eros as love, sensual beauty, and feminine sexuality. For Cinderella's emerging sense of her feminine energy to be constricted to that form would have been deadly, probably the type of energy her beautiful, flirtatious stepsisters would have displayed toward the prince. The pigeon house is in the king's and prince's backyard, suggesting the trap for Cinderella is at the archetypal masculine level, with her father as a citizen of that realm, reflecting how she personally experienced the imbalance of masculine and feminine energy stated in the first sentence of our fairy tale. So this is level 1 anima. The anima as a sex object for a man, what the feminists complain about. But I think as a man, one must be careful because the combination of men being more visually oriented and testosterone driving towards objectification of the opposite sex is biologically natural and not a sexist pathology. So tonight, the lecture is shorter. What I just mentioned here, if you would like to explore that topic more deeply, we'll have plenty of time to do it. I think it's a very important topic. I feel it particularly strongly here in America, and you're working with young men, trying to know how to relate to the so-called liberated women. So Bob Dylan sang about Cinderella's Aphrodite pigeon house trap in Desolation Row on one of my 2 all-time favorite record albums, Highway 61 Revisited. I think this came out about 1965. The power of music as described under the image in hexagram 16, enthusiasm, is powerfully conveyed in the words and the way Bob Dylan sings Desolation Row. So I'll do a very pale imitation of Bob Dylan here as we go through the stanza. So Cinderella, she seems so easy. It takes one to know one. She smiles and puts her hands in her back pockets, Betty Davis style. And in comes Romeo, he's moaning, you belong to me, I believe. And someone says, you're in the wrong place, my friend. You'd better leave. And the only sound that's left after the ambulances go is Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Row.
Great, Dennis.
So if you can possibly do it, do try to listen to the song. Bob Dylan's voice and his intonation is very unique. I provided Coco with the link to the YouTube video, and you want to start at 1 minute, 8 seconds. That's where he starts to sing about Cinderella. Bob Dylan was one of the kind of archetypal images for many of us in the 1960s, particularly people like me, college-age young men that were 1A for the draft for the Vietnam War. And we knew it was a tremendous mistake, but we just felt so helpless and powerless in trying to oppose it. And Dylan, like I said, if you have a chance to listen to him, just the tone of his voice and the way he kind of whines about stuff, it really captured a feeling of how many of us young men felt, and a lot of young women too, but we young men back then had literally our lives were on the line. And to me, Desolation Row personally is a perfect example of what the Ching says about the power of music, how it can loosen the grip of obscure emotions and move all hearts. Here, like I said, we're talking about Cinderella as level 1 anima, kind of a sex object for the man. And Dylan presents her as being easy. In American slang, that means an easy lay or a promiscuous woman. And Betty Davis, he sang about Betty Davis style. She was a sex symbol and a pinup girl for the American GIs in World War II. And here's an image of Betty Davis. So Romeo is an archetypal image, the archetypal lover, as Shakespeare described him in Romeo and Juliet. And the fate of such love is conveyed by Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Row after Romeo had been carted off in an ambulance. So Dylan was an artist with words and using words to create images. So Romeo, to be a big lover, you have to have a lot of confidence in yourself. And in Dylan saying, in comes Romeo, he's moaning, you belong to me, I believe. And then someone says, you're in the wrong place, my friend, you'd better leave. So how deadly the embodiment of that form of feminine energy is within the context of Cinderella's rich old man scenic father energy is shown by the father's disturbing response to seeing a woman associated with Aphrodite who's up a tree. Notice that he has some suspicion that it could be his daughter. At a deep level, we could imagine in his dream world, he would be aware of the harm he's done to his anima, his soul. So can you imagine a situation where you as a father think that your daughter might be inside a pigeon house, and your way to find out is to get an axe and hack it to pieces? This is how deadly it would be for Cinderella to expose this level and type of feminine energy at this tender stage of her development. I see it as a defensive reaction by the dominant, overarching Senex energy to want to destroy what would put you to shame if exposed for your stance in life, what that has done to your soul. So the pigeon house and the pear tree are not in the Disney Perot version that we'll look at next week. So this really kind of deadly side of the, what I call the Senex masculine energy, is only in this fairy tale. And it really emphasizes, I think, the significance of the old masculine on the feminine in this fairy tale. And it's because of the father's actions at a moment like this, like I said, that I am emphasizing the significance of the masculine enemy, Freudian slip, masculine energy in this fairy tale. So fortunately, Cinderella escaped before the hacking began, but what a lesson she learned from manifesting as a love goddess form of feminine energy within her father's world. She would have to integrate the darker, more negative energy of the pigeon, the defensive, protecting energy of its pecking, aggressive side, as we will see at the end of the tale. What happened to Cinderella to end up back in the ashes? She got caught back in her witch emotional state. So at this point of her development, there's a tremendous tension between the dark, negative feelings and the paradisical world that can be lived and acted out sometimes. In the fairy tale, this cycle happened 3 times, but in life, it can happen thousands of times. We get caught in the strong negative mother complex of despair, negativity, and destructiveness. So there was too quick a change for the opposites to be integrated. But the individuation process is underway for Cinderella. This can be a dangerous time in therapy when a person first starts to come out of a depression, and suicide is then a risk. Somewhat related to that is something that I've seen with people that have, fairly serious mental conditions, and they get medication that really helps them, and they feel pretty good and positive. But if and when that medication doesn't work anymore and they go back to their initial depressive state, it's really a difficult time. And I worked with somebody with whom that happened twice. And after it happened the second time, he did not want to try any more meds because the thought of having to go back to such an initial depressive state was just too unbearable. So he preferred to stay in that more depressed state. So look at the images here and think of this as being one person, not Cinderella and her stepsisters or something, but part of herself feels beautiful and is being seen by a member of the opposite sex or another person, or just being recognized. But there's still another part that says, no, you're kidding yourself. You're really stupid. You're ugly, et cetera, et cetera. That's where she's at now, really ripped apart by these two very opposite dimensions. And I saw this, a personal example from my practice was with a woman that I had mentioned before who had a very serious mental disturbance. And we'd worked for a while, and she was beginning to make some progress. She had gone through an ugly divorce, or was in the process of that. And she had a dream where she was looking out from her balcony, and her soon-to-be ex-husband was walking by below her, and he said, nobody will ever like you, and you're always going to be lonely. So Catherine Osper had a different take on the pigeon house from this segment of the tale. She took it as an extreme extension of the peak experience of being at the ball, wanting to stay in a paradise fantasy of Aphrodite and the Holy Spirit, those both associated with the pigeons. The Ashes Cinderella is the other end of this extreme polarity. And Cinderella is caught in the inflation of an idealized state, a grandiosity and archetypal identification of always wanting to be good like a dove. But the reality is we can't be saints or connected to the eternal, the archetypal, all the time. Osper then sees the father's pickaxe reaction as the angry response from the outer world to being around an inflated person because they are not behaving in a human way. This is what Jung meant about the inhuman, totally impersonal dimension of archetypes. Inflated people are aggressive around others. They metaphorically use a pickaxe to chop off the heads of people around them. This makes them unpleasant to be around and leads to isolation. On the other side, the person cuts off their own life in autoaggressive acts associated with the negative mother complex. So Osper has worked with this fairy tale actually much longer than I have. So what I presented to you in this segment are two rather different ways of looking at the masculine in the fairy tale. And I feel pretty comfortable in the perspective that I've presented. And you can feel it out for yourself, which one, or you can maybe think, well, both have some elements of the truth, or some ways psychologically we can relate to this tale, which is part of the beauty of archetypal material. You can come at it from several different angles. So a positive symbol in that last segment that we looked at was the dim little oil lamp burning on the mantelpiece when Cinderella got back home and was in the ashes. This could be a sign that there is some light, some consciousness and hope coming into Cinderella's life. Light from an oil lamp is soft and mellow, and oil is also a healing light, a healing balm. So also think about a light from a candle or a lamp in comparison to like our incandescent lamps. The lamp, the flame is very responsive to the environment around it, and that's how Osper described the feminine as relatedness, related to the environment, whereas the masculine is often associated more with the sun, and that's just that steady, bright light. And if you want to create a romantic atmosphere, you probably will turn the lights off and burn a candle or something. So this is another way of, if you think of it, of describing of Cinderella cultivating, developing her own form of the feminine energy. It's not the burned out ashes, but it's some light above the fireplace. Back to the tale. So day 2 of the festival saw Cinderella getting an even more beautiful dress from the bird, and everybody was astonished at her beauty. She was allowing more of her developing inner soul beauty to show. So the prince danced only with her as his partner, as he said, but again she sprang away from him and nimbly climbed the branches of a beautiful tall tree in the garden behind the house, on which hung the most magnificent pears. So here's where fairy tales are like dreams. I mean, can you imagine a woman in a very beautiful ballroom dress, nimbly climbing up a tree? So look what happens next. She clambered so nimbly between the branches like a squirrel that the king's son did not know where she had gone. He waited until her father came and said to him, "The unknown maiden has escaped from me, and I believe she has climbed the pear tree." The father thought, "Can it be Cinderella?" He had an axe brought and cut the tree down, but no one was on it. And when they got into the kitchen, Cinderella lay there among the ashes as usual, for she had jumped down the other side of the tree, had taken the beautiful dress to the bird on the little hazelnut tree, and put on her gray gown. So we'll have to get more Freudian here, if you will, and really look at the level 1 anima. So the pear has strong associations to femininity because of its shape. We're talking about the nice buttocks of the female of our species that men are programmed to be irresistibly drawn to. The bigger feminine buttocks is because the woman has a much bigger pelvic bones than a man to enable her to bear the heavy weight of a baby in the womb. There is also the sensuous, erotic dimension of a pear because it is sweet and juicy. So think Freudian here. Every man is aware of what is on the other side of that beautiful buttocks. So the archetypal motherly dimensions enters with the hips and their associations with a baby. There are old goddess statues with huge hips and large breasts, and a pear also looks a bit like the breast and the uterus. The pear is sacred to Hera, the Greek goddess of marriage and motherhood. So Cinderella would have suffered the same fate as her mother and stepsisters had she gotten trapped in the mother archetype and in the erotic feminine, the erotic feminine being more related to the pigeons. Note that these two archetypes are well developed in the old king's garden. The pear tree is tall and beautiful. So Osper associates Cinderella and the pear tree as an inflation of wanting to be all motherly, a helper syndrome. This reverts back to the beginning of the story where the dying mother tells Cinderella to be pious and good. The father cuts through the inflation or identification of only wanting to be good by cutting down the tree. That's Osper's take on it. So Osper is basically saying that the father is serving a positive role in kind of destroying that inflation. And I'm saying that the father is demonstrating the deadly effects in his old king form, if you will, on the feminine as the mother, how the woman can get trapped in the mother archetype and constricted to that energies in the old kingdom, if you will. So to put this part of the tale, the pigeon house and the pear tree, into kind of a historical, cultural context here in America with women's liberation that started really gaining steam in the late 60s. We saw women trying to free themselves from just being like sex goddesses or the mother archetype. And now in America, we certainly have the liberated women, but we also have a lot of evangelical Christians. And in that context, the more traditional Christianity of the 50s, as I call it, the woman's place is in the home and to be a mother. So that's that to me is kind of like the old king. For a woman to be fully embodied, if you will, it's totally different from a man. Just the cycles with the menstruation and so on, and actually having the bigger hips, just to be embodied and feel the bigger hips, and to carry a child. I mean, those are all the primal basic elements of the feminine. There's so much more to it, but that as kind of a foundational aspect for the woman. And the other thing is how women can get trapped in that mother archetype. And von Franz talked about it, I think, in the archetypal feminine and fairy tales, where in one of the tales she told, the woman coming back from having achieved the prize was going to see a baby crying beside the road, and she was to ignore the baby.
Sorry, I need to clarify. When the woman you gave an example, ignore the baby, and she came from the achievement or the difficult situation in giving birth to the baby.
No, it's like in stories about women going on the heroic journey, if you will, and they get the prize. But in fairy tales and in life, then you have to return to your daily life. And in the process of coming back from having achieved the prize at the archetypal level and trying to then return home, if you will, the challenge in the fairy tale von Franz was talking about was, I think it was there was a hungry baby beside the road, or a crying baby, and the woman was to ignore it. So that was like saying, don't get trapped in the archetype of the mother. There's more to you as a woman, if you will, than being a mother. And this is related to a very important Jungian concept. Jung really emphasized the importance of consciousness, and his definition of enlighten was to bring as much light as possible into the unconscious. To be highly conscious in a Jungian sense is to be aware of what archetypes you're living out of. So instead of unconsciously living out of them, to be conscious of that gives you a little more freedom and actually allows you to look archetypally at other elements in your environment. But recognizing your own archetypal pattern is really important in a Jungian context. Back to the fairy tale. So on the third day of the festival, Cinderella gets an even more splendid and magnificent dress that astonished everyone to the point that they couldn't speak. So her slippers were golden, a most precious metal associated with the sun, incorruptibility, and immortality. Cinderella's inner soul had reached its maximum, and its golden color is showing forth from her new standpoint. Shoes cover the feet, and feet are related to your standpoint or your position in life. So the enthralled prince dances only again with her as his partner. But experience has taught him that she's likely to slip away from him once again as evening approaches. So he smeared pitch on the staircase that Cinderella would run down, and one of her slippers got stuck on it, and, quote, the king's son picked it up, and it was small and dainty and all golden, end of quote. We'll see at the end of the tale that Cinderella, when she was in the ashes, was wearing her clumsy wooden shoes. So metaphorically, think of this golden dainty slipper in comparison to the clumsy wooden shoes. Those are the two states that Cinderella is fluctuating between, kind of in an anheldromia in Jungian terms. Actually, I compare this stage of Cinderella to Wisconsin winter, Wisconsin weather in March. And the saying is, March is a lion or a lamb. So we have these really nice days where it's beginning to feel like spring is coming and you're really excited. And then a snowstorm comes through like tomorrow morning. You're up and you're down and you're just tired of winter, but this fluctuation back and forth is difficult. And that's one thing I really like about the I Ching, especially as a Jungian analyst and eco-psychologist. It makes uses many metaphors relating to the land and the seasons and even to farming. So you can see how this archetypal motif with Cinderella, we feel it is a very human story, but it's the same archetypal motif that, like I say, somebody like me and those of us here in Wisconsin feel with regard to the seasons, especially in the month of March. This is Cinderella's third fleeing, indicating she still cannot sustain a presentation of her beautiful side to others. She lost her left shoe, the connection to the body and the unconscious. She is not yet feeling the link between the body and the self. She has not embodied the beautiful self-image. So at its most fundamental level, I see this as the relationship of hexagram 1 in the I Ching to hexagram 2. Hexagram 1 being the spirit, kind of the image of oneself in its purest form, and hexagram 2 is all the difficulties of embodying that in your body and in your life and in your relationships and so on. And it's kind of related in alchemy to what they call a unio mentalis, the mental union, but then that has to be brought into space and time and manifested. Unio and mentalis, the kind of a mental image of the conjunctio. And one of the ways I've described relationship of hexagram 1 to 2 is quoting Edison, that great inventor who developed the light bulb. But he said genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So in hexagram 2, the receptive in the I Ching, the animal image is the mare, the female horse. So it's a powerful animal, and it has to, roam the prairies just like the male, including when it's pregnant and defending its young. But so that's the way the I Ching talks about the embodiment of the spirit from hexagram 1. And that to me is one of the beauties of working with something like the I Ching. You can look at a fairy tale like this, and this stage of the fairy tale, for example, and you can go down to that most fundamental level of hexagram 1 and 2, all yang and all yin energy. There are many other levels, of course, but like I said, with this archetypal concept, especially as presented in the I Ching, it helps you think and frame things at these many different levels. And I developed that concept quite extensively in the lecture I gave on the I Ching to the Orange County Jung Society, and that's on the internet. So often in therapy, we have to get creative and show some foresight to trick ourselves when we become conscious that we are in danger of falling back into the unconscious. It can be a helpful thought like, I know where this is going to end up if I start down this path. Take the first step in that direction, have just one drink, etc. So this is the intuitive realm and the domain of Hermes, the archetypal trickster in Greek mythology. So the prince capturing Cinderella's shoe is like bringing some consciousness into the complex, which by definition is unconscious. A positive relationship is beginning to be established with the masculine side of Cinderella, her animus. And this happened indeed in my last session today. Fellow I've been working with for some years, bipolar. Meds are helping a lot. But still, he was talking about, since he had the most recent COVID, which was a couple of weeks ago, that he's kind of more inclined to be depressed. And when he starts down that way, he has some sense like at the end of the hallway, there's something really dark that he can get paranoid about. And at the same time, he starts having these thoughts about the last big relationship with a woman where it was very intense, but in the end, it broke up. So that kind of connection with the anima really comes back to him. But he's been through this so many times, and we've seen that motif in his dreams of kind of falling off a cliff, if you will, that he's aware when these things are coming. So to be aware of that, then the things that have helped him, he realizes he's very introverted, that it's time to socialize more. And also he finds that exercising, especially outdoors, really helps him. So you have to be aware that you're falling down the trap. That's a consciousness. And then hopefully you'll be able to do things about it, like my analysis. And especially if I'm working with a woman in that type of a situation, I'm very likely to point out that, whoa, you're like Cinderella going from the ball to the ashes. And that helps them put their personal experience into an archetypal framework. So a shoe is a sexual symbol. It's the receptacle for the phallic foot that gets inserted into it. This can symbolize the fit between a man and a woman in a very concrete and sexual sense. It can also symbolize the fit between two people or between the masculine and feminine side of an individual. In some cultures, the shoe can be part of a gift to the husband at the wedding. Anne and Barry Ulanoff, in their excellent book, Cinderella and Her Sisters, The Envied and the Envying, point out how unique and individual a shoe is. We must wear it for a while to break it in and to fit our feet exactly. This corresponds to our unique and individual character, as we can imagine our Cinderella to be. It requires a unique male character to fill the shoe, best imagined in Jungian terms as a woman's animus being her unique image of her soul mate, her soul, and vice versa for the man. The sexual union of the shoe, of the foot in the shoe, must be imagined in its fullest physical and erotic dimensions and its symbolic aspects as a union of the opposites. Remember in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in the chapter on Freud, at the end of that chapter, Jung said, sex is just as important to me as it is to Freud, but Freud missed the symbolic dimension. We can think of the symbolism of the union of opposites, and alchemy can be portrayed as a couple's mating. So the symbolism important, that would be something like the unio mentalis in alchemy, but do not miss that physical dimension of sex and intercourse and the smells and the sounds and just the pure physicality. It's really both of them. You don't want to separate one from the other. So one way I think of it is like some academics, a very academic, maybe even a university type male and a university type female, or big executives and powerful people in making love, just getting down into the basic primal masculine and the primal feminine, just getting it on. And that's one dimension that Hermes brings to the Greek world, is that connection between Apollo and the Apollonic realm and the pure physical. And one of the ways, one of the Greek goddesses, Aphrodite, Zeneca, was worshipped was by telling crass jokes. One of the reasons I called my book The Dairy Farmer's Guide to the Universe, I hope never to lose that connection I felt with the animals and the breeding of the animals and that whole the animal level of the human psyche. And that's one of the senses I got on my last trip to China, especially just thinking about these things. China has made this tremendous leap into the modern industrialized world in such a short period of time. So you have so many Chinese that really feel and have these strong connections yet to the rural areas where they came from and understand, I don't know if it's the Spring Festival or what, but where people really try to get back to the towns and the villages that they came from. And Terrence told me when I was in China, he was my beloved guide when I was in China this last time, and told me that a lot of times when people go to their hometowns, it's a really like a connection to the family roots and the family roots to the land and place, and that there can be rituals and ceremonies that people do then. And that just gave me such a different sense about the Chinese culture and how fundamentally different in that regard it is from American culture. And I really admire that. So there were a very tiny percentage of people from my generation that grew up on a farm, and dairy farming is one of the most intense kind of farming because you got to be there morning and night every day of the year to milk the cows. And I think I'm the only Jungian analyst in Chicago that grew up on a farm. And that's one reason I love the Wilhelm translation of the I Ching so much, is because he brings in those agricultural and seasonal analogies. And when he does that, I can feel what he's talking about and what those hexagrams mean. So next week, I will explore the important emphasis on envy that the Yulenovs have on Cinderella, which incorporates several other psychoanalytic formulations that complement the Jungian perspective. So let's finish off tonight's presentation with Cinderella's shoe. That was small and dainty. How feminine can you get? Golden, of ultimate value, and from her left foot, the entree to the unconscious complex. With this section, we saw some of the brutality that can come from the masculine side in the Cinderella complex. And next week, we will see another aspect of the feminine side in terms of brutality, with the mother's response to the sisters trying in the shoe. So this is not one size or one side being responsible for the violence. It comes from violence both from the masculine side and the feminine side. And at the most fundamental level, it's the consequence of the imbalance of the masculine and feminine energy with, like from the very first line, imbalance primarily because of most of the energy being in the yang domain.
So Dennis, the first question is, we'd like to know, in your practice, would you use the fairy tale with your client, or you just use the fairy tale to understand the client with a greater background? And we like to know how you use the fairy tale in your practice, and if you use it, and on which situation you will use and how you use it. Could you please illustrate with examples?
There are two fairy tales that Chicago Institute has me do, or these are the two that I choose to do when I go down to Chicago. And Cinderella is one. And the other I see as the complement to this, namely Iron Hans or Iron John. With women in particular, I'm often able to relate them to Cinderella. And I did that just last week with a woman that's just started analysis with me. There was a very powerful dream that she had. I won't mention what it was, but archetypally, I treated it as revealing the various levels, including very deep levels of the collective unconscious. And then she really tied into that and started feeling she was excited about that, and then started feeling excited about our work. I said that she is like really Cinderella, just starting to make wishes, that she's at this very early stage. don't want to frighten her about how much work is ahead. But I said, you really like Cinderella when the tree is starting to grow, because this woman talked how she had been crying a lot during the week when she was thinking of how much her unlived life has been. She's in her early 70s. And that's why she wanted to start analysis with me. She just feel that she really hasn't lived much of a life. And then she had these dreams and then was excited about, whoa, here's some archetypal domains that I could be opening up to. And I told her, and this is how you fit this in. I said, well, you really like Cinderella just when she's be able to make wishes to the bird and the tree, and something is just starting to come to life. That's how I used it with a woman. So this is a great fairy tale for the woman's kind of the woman's self image and a man's anima, but a tale that I'm able to refer a lot of men to is Iron John. And that's kind of the inverse of this fairy tale, because in Iron John, Iron Hans says it's in the Grimm's version, it's really about masculine energy that's in a deadly form, in a wild man form. And in that fairy tale, the problem is because the feminine is constricting the masculine. So in that fairy tale, the wild man, that's after he's been captured and in a cage in the king's courtyard, and the prince's golden ball rolls into the cage, the boy wants his ball back, and the wild man says, let me out of the cage. And the boy says, I can't, I don't have the key. And here's the whole, the way it's compared to the inverse of Cinderella. The wild man says, the key is under your mother's pillow. So I gave a good example of that in the presentation of case one at that Sandplay conference. I think you have it recorded. And this was a man who had a terrible mother complex. In fact, he came in with a dream about a witch. And we worked really hard and long at that. And he just got to the point where he dreamt that these archaeologists had excavated a man that had been dead for a long time, and it had long wavy hair, which is how the wild man was described in Grimm's fairy tale. And that man was just starting to come to life. That was the end of the dream. So he was just beginning to get in touch with that energy. And that's a very dangerous moment, because you're just getting in touch with it, and you felt so constricted all your life, and that's what his dreams were showing, and he wanted to manifest it. And then what I said in the fairy tale, that for various reasons he stopped analysis at that time, and back in his hometown he joined some motorcycle group where they said just do it, and within a short period of time he had a psychotic episode. Because in that fairy tale, it's really about then how do you, once you're in touch with that energy, how do you kind of tame it and humanize it and be able to work it into your life and your culture? Part of that taming, if you will, in the fairy tale was at one point he became a warrior and he just slaughtered the enemy. So this energy can come out in a very primal, deadly form, like I said, and that's the kind of energy that has to be transmuted, transformed. And I told him that, whoa, you're just getting in touch with that. You got to be very careful. And like I said, for various reasons, he wasn't able to continue with me. He lived several hours away from where we were doing our work. And that I saw as one of the consequences of not being able to be contained by that archetypal story and work through it to the end. So when, as an analyst, you can recognize the archetypal pattern, and when you see something like this in a dream, where this wild man that was buried a long time ago is coming to life, as an analyst, you know that, boy, you're like dealing with a powder keg. that there's a lot of energy that could come out in a very destructive form, an overwhelming form. You, as the analyst, are aware of what you're dealing with, and then it's a question of how much do you tell the analysand and how do you help them frame their experience. So I could say a lot more about that, but maybe we might consider the possibility of me doing Iron Haunts with your group. And now then we get back to Cinderella now.
You know, you have shown us there are different versions of the fairy tales, and also some part is abridged, and then how to choose or analyze the different versions, how to deal with the differences, and the different versions. Those different versions has to do with the writer, him or herself.
Yeah, that's why next week I'll spend, once I go through the whole tale from my and Osper perspective, I'll try to go through briefly the Ulenov's perspective. And that's the Disney version, if you will. And I'll point out some of the significant differences, which lead to quite a different take on the tale. And it more clearly emphasizes as a motif envy and the envied, for reasons I'll point out next week. So depending on the gestalt, the cosmology, if you will, of the particular fairy tale, different things are coming to the fore. And like I said, in this tale, I've been emphasizing the negative effect on the masculine. But when we look at the version next week, the fact that the father is not mentioned that much, for example, and the stepsisters are ugly, that immediately puts you more in the domain of envy, I think. And the way the Ulenovs develop it is that much purer behavior on Cinderella's part is the Ulenovs made a connection with Cinderella as a female Christ. But in the Grimm's version, I don't see or feel Cinderella as being a female Christ. But with that different setup, that different archetypal pattern in the Disney version, I can see how it could lead to that take.
Mm.
You always got to stay within the context of the story of the particular version of Cinderella that you're working with. And it's also important to consider the historical context that the fairy tale came out of, like the Grimms were collecting their fairy tales in Germany in the mid 1800s. But also I think of the I Ching, I mean, archetypal stories and how the feminine is presented. And there's even a hexagram about the concubines. And I don't think you have that in China nowadays. So you want to bring that into your consideration of the story as well. And there's something about this Cinderella tale that, as von Franz said in the first lecture I gave, but particularly with Cinderella and the way this tale is developed, I feel that it is ahistorical and acultural. There's just something at such a fundamental archetypal level about the relationships of the masculine to the feminine energy and the yang and the yin energy that I think it's a timeless fairy tale. For example, with the Grimms, a critique of many of their fairy tales is that the woman is like this helpless damsel that has to be rescued by a man. That's not how I feel about the Cinderella tale we're working with.
Yeah, and in today's presentation, you mentioned that inflated person will decapitalize the others, cut off others' head around him or her. So could you please say more about it?
Yeah, that's such an interesting concept that Jung had, that really, if you are captivated by an archetype and you're in that living in that archetypal domain, if you will, you've lost a lot of your humanity. That's like a realm of the gods and goddesses, and that is to inspire you in a way, but you are not to be a god or a goddess. Two ways come to mind. One would be university professor, but another would be a medical doctor. they can get so captivated by the archetype of the healer that there's something human that's missing from them. They're just they are the doctor and you are the patient. Person who wrote about that very beautifully was Adolf Guggenbuch Craig in a very important book called The Power in the Helping Profession. Guggenbuch Craig was the head of the Jung Institute while I was there, a Swiss psychiatrist. And I think he opened his book by talking about being on vacation. And he saw a doctor with his family. And the doctor was still being a doctor. He didn't feel much like a father with the kids, that very human, kind of somewhat vulnerable, masculine energy. And that is kind of related to this idea of people that are captivated by the archetypes can chop off the heads of people. They can be like some of the professors can be very intolerant of somebody who asks what they consider to be a dumb question, you know? And I met a prof like that in Madison who could not relate to the graduate students because they were below her level. So you wouldn't be at a party with graduate students in it, for example. You're captivated by the archetype of the teacher. And if you're in one archetypal polarity, it's really important, as one of the Dan Lindley, a Chicago analyst, had pointed out, who was a professor. It's important as well to feel like being the student and the learner. That's where you get the balance. And that's one thing you got to be careful with as an analyst as well. You know, one of the analysts I knew, I mean, often in just being with him in an informal sense, he had this analytic gaze. And it's like, come on, we're just friends talking here. I'm not in analysis with you right now. We're drinking a beer together.
So the next question is about the timing when the Cinderella left, escape. We are wondering, and if it's the midnight, or is there some limitations on the time, or otherwise her dress or the magic will disappear, or it represents the transformation from yin and yang.
Yes, I think in the Disney version of Cinderella, I think it might have been at midnight, but I'll review that before next week. But in this fairy tale, it was mentioned as evening approached. And so evening and the darkness, if you think of the daylight as being consciousness and night being the unconscious, to me, that's symbolically a very clear statement that as that after a period of time, the unconscious, dark, punishing side began to creep in. That's how I saw that. So just remember, that's the basic idea of the complex. The simplest way of talking about it is somebody said that he's beside himself. Well, where did he go and what's there now? So it's the idea that when the complex is activated, it takes you over. It pushes your consciousness aside and it takes over. And that's what we have very clearly happening, seeing in Cinderella at the ball. There's part of her that's coming out and feeling more and more comfortable and conscious and connected with her true self, but there's still that powerful negative emotional side that can come in and undo it. And that is something that you see in working with people in depth for some period of time. And as they're starting to get better, things will happen and they just get sucked right back into their old stuff again. So we're ending tonight with Cinderella's left shoe in the prince's hand. So what's going to happen next? I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Coco, Shay Shay.
Thank you. Good night.
I'll see you next week.